Today, we discuss the cult of Osiris. Stay tuned to find out more about the Egyptian god who's dead and loving it on this episode of Ancient Egypt and the Bible. While at Karnak Temple, the kings of Egypt worshipped Amun-Re. Osiris was the center of every mortuary cult in Egypt and was ubiquitous all over the land. This had a profound influence on funerary customs and notions of the afterlife for practically every Egyptian. The Osiris cult has its beginnings in the pre-dynastic period in the small Upper Egyptian village of Abydos. Abydos was the cemetery town where the kings of Dynasty 0 to Dynasty 2, the earliest kings of Egypt, built their tombs. And it was at Abydos where Osiris was venerated uniquely as the god who not only ruled the underworld, but also could restore the dead in a never-ending process of cyclic eternity, where the deceased spirit could return nightly to his mummy or proxy body. During the Old Kingdom and First Intermediate period, the Osiris cult was considered the leading mortuary cult for the early kings of Egypt. But the cult had not risen to where it had reached its primacy. Several other mortuary cults existed during the Old Kingdom, and people held to a more eclectic practice where the Egyptians accepted many diverse mortuary religious traditions. This would change with the Middle Kingdom. When the kings of the Middle Kingdom embraced the Osiris cult and gave the cult royal patronage, they poured a lot of money into the worship of Osiris, and they promoted Abydos as the preeminent cult site of the Osiris cult. The Middle Kingdom kings had an almost evangelical zeal for the cult of Osiris. They evangelized the cult of Osiris throughout Egypt. And royal sanction started a process of syncretization that allowed the Osiris cult to swallow up other mortuary cults. For example, the Osiris cult merged with the popular Sokar cult to create the composite god Sokar Osiris. The god Sokar was the falconine god of the dead. Sokar was famous for his festival, which performed a kind of resurrection ritual. A bark shrine was filled with grain, then water was poured over the grain, and finally the bark was taken away and buried in a dark place where it would sprout, showing newness of life. The Osiris cult adopted this ritual, but instead of using a bark, the Osiris cult made corn mummies, where essentially these fake mummies filled with grain that was in the same way, filled with poured water over top and then buried in a dark place. Moreover, the kings of the Middle Kingdom thought that the tomb of Horus Den, a First Dynasty king, was the tomb of the original Osiris. And they came to venerate this tomb as the tomb of a god. A processional causeway was built leading up to the tomb, and thousands of people put their devotional stelae on the path leading up to Horus Den's tomb. Later in the New Kingdom and Third Intermediate period, the creation cult of Ptah was synchronized into the Sokar Osiris cult to form the Ptah Sokar Osiris worship, which gave this composite god the attributes of a creation deity as well as being god of the dead. The Osiris cult was a religion that had its finger on the pulse. It looked outside of itself and took popular religious practice and grafted it into the cult and customized it for Osiris worship. The Osiris cult took the pre-dynastic bovine worship of the Apis bull and co-opted it in the Third Intermediate Period as Apis Osiris or Osirapis, and even was called Serapis in the Hellenistic period. In this syncretization, the god Osiris physically manifests as the Apis bull. If you want to know more about the Serapis cult, please see the card above. Despite all this syncretism, the biography of the Osiris myth maintained consistency over the millennia. Osiris was the firstborn son of Geb, the earth god, and Nut, the sky goddess. He married his sister Isis and became king over the land of the living. He was tricked by his brother Seth, who cut up his body and spread out his parts all over Egypt. Isis and Nephthys gathered Osiris's parts and sewed them together. They reanimated the corpse and copulated with it to produce two sons, Horus, son of Osiris and Isis, and Anubis, son of Osiris and Nephthys. The reanimation of Osiris resulted in his resurrection in the underworld. Osiris became king of the underworld, and he developed the power to make the dead godlike in order to prevent the dead decaying, both in body and in spirit, in the afterlife. The Osiris cult remained the preeminent mortuary cult in Egypt until the Roman period. With the introduction of Neoplatonism, Osiris worship became idealized as representing the world, mundus. And the cult had influence in the wider Roman world through the Serapis cult. But more purist forms of the Osiris cult were never as popular as the Isis and Horus cults. So anyway, I want to thank you for watching. I hope you learned something today, and I will see you next time on Ancient Egypt and the Bible.